Today we will learn about food webs. Needs of living things. All organisms need certain things in order to survive, such as food or energy, water, minerals, gases, an appropriate environment. We'll investigate how organisms get their food or make their food. The main source of energy comes from the sun. Plants use the sun's energy for photosynthesis and create their own food. And animals eat plants, or they eat other animals that eat plants. Plants are producers because they can make their own food using photosynthesis. So by using the energy from the sun, producers are able to make their own food. In the food chain the picture on the screen, grass is a producer because grass can make its own food. And if you didn't know anything about grass, you can tell that it's a producer by looking at the picture because there's no arrows pointing at the grass. Consumers are organisms that cannot make their own food, and they get their energy by feeding on producers or by feeding on other consumers. In the picture of the food chain, the grasshopper, the frog, and the python are all consumers. You can tell that they're consumers because there's arrows pointing at them. Primary consumers or first level consumers are animals that eat producers in a food chain. In this example, grasshopper is a primary consumer because it feeds on the producer. Secondary consumers, also known as second-level consumers, are animals that eat first-level consumers in a food chain. In this example, the frog is a secondary consumer. So the food chain starts here, grass. Grass gets eaten by the grasshopper. The grasshopper is a first-level consumer. The grasshopper gets eaten by the frog. The frog is a second-level consumer. The tertiary consumer, also known as the third-level consumer, is an animal that eats a second-level consumer. For example, the python is the third-level consumer. So again, the food chain would start with the sun, right? The grass uses the sun to make its own food. The grass gets eaten by the grasshopper gets eaten by the frog, and the frog gets eaten by the python. So it goes producer, first level up gets eaten by the second level gets eaten by the third level consumer. So in addition to the producer group, the consumer group, there's a third group called decomposers. A decomposer is an organism that gets its energy by breaking down bodies of dead organisms and returning the nutrients back into the soil. So decomposers are their own group. They're not producers and they're not consumers either. Some examples of decomposers are things like earthworms, bacteria, and fungi. We have been talking about food chains this whole time. A food chain is a diagram used to show how energy from food passes from one organism to another. A food chain always begins with the sun. The arrows on a food chain means get eaten by. A food web looks like the picture on the screen. A food web is a diagram that describes several overlapping food chains in an ecosystem, so in an area. It shows how energy moves through a community. A food web is more accurate because in real life, animals depend on many different things for food, not just one thing. So a food web shows a more accurate depiction of what happens in an ecosystem. Here's another example of a food web. So let's start with producer level. The producer here is cordgrass, and I can tell that it's cordgrass because there's no arrow pointing at it. Another producer is this detritus is another producer, and again, if I've never even heard of what a detritus is, I can tell that it's a producer because there's no arrow pointing at it. And then you can see the feeding relationship. So detritus gets eaten by the grass shrimp gets eaten by the minnow, and the minnow gets eaten by the otter. There's no arrows coming from the otter to anything else, so nothing eats the otter in this picture. If you look at the blue crab here, you can tell that the blue crab eats the minnow because there's an arrow pointing from the minnow to the blue crab. It eats the periwinkle, and I think that's all that it eats because those are the only arrows pointing to the blue crab. But the blue crab gets eaten by several different animals. You just look at the arrows pointing from the blue crab to other things. So the blue crab gets eaten by the otter, it gets eaten by the gull, and it gets eaten by the terrapin. You can tell what the apex or the top level consumer is in the food web when there's no arrows pointing from that animal to anything else. So there's two apex predators in this example of the food web, and that's the gull and the otter. Those two animals don't get eaten by anything. Just a comparison. This is a food chain, and this is a food web. And again, a food web is more accurate because it shows several different feeding relationships in the ecosystem. So going back to consumers, there's several different types of consumers. An herbivore is an animal that eats only plants, for example, a cow. An omnivore is an animal that eats both plants and animals, such as us, and dogs are omnivores. Carnivores are animals that eat only other animals, such as the tiger, the hawk, a killer whale. And a scavenger is an animal that eats decaying animals or plants, such as a hyena or a vulture. So a scavenger is not the same thing as a decomposer. A scavenger is just an animal that prefers to find things that's already dead and it consumes it. A decomposer decomposes dead matter and decays it, turning it into nutrients for the soil. So that's the main difference, is that decomposers can return nutrients into the soil, whereas scavengers just eat and they're able to digest dead parts of animals. The predator-prey relationship, the predator is a hunter, such as the lion in this picture, and the prey is the hunted, such as the zebra. Thank you.